Hello, welcome back. In this video, I'm going to cover the physical aspects of total body irradiation, TBI. And I'll get into some of the properties of the beams and the treatment planning and other considerations. So let me start with some clinical considerations because it may seem like a very bad idea to irradiate somebody's entire body, but there are really good clinical reasons to do this that is beneficial for patients. So we'll start with that. It's used either in a myeloablative fashion where you ablate stem cells in the patient's bone marrow, and that will be done at a higher dose. Here are the fractionation schemas. Or it's done in a non-myeloablative fashion to suppress the immune system. So let's go over some of the key goals that we have in terms of the dosimetry of total body irradiation. Number one, you should have an even dose throughout the body because you're irradiating the patient's entire bone marrow system. The variation should be less than 10% according to the protocols. You will need to limit the lung dose in some cases to avoid toxicities. And you'll need to limit the dose rates. And here are the typical rates that are called for. And that's, again, because of the biological effects that happen at higher dose rates. This shows some of the basic equipment for TBI and the setup. So a patient will stand typically in a stand like this. Here's a drawing of it. Linux pointed sideways, and the beam comes out like this to cover the whole body. So the patient is treated AP and then turned around and treated PA. There's other equipment like the spoiler and compensators, and I'll talk about those a little bit later. But this is the basic kind of a setup for TBI. Another important feature is that these treatments are done at extended distances, so typically 400 centimeters, for example. Now I'd like to go over some of these features and why they're important. So first off, a key feature is the extended distance. There are a couple reasons for that. One is you can get a large field, which will cover the whole body, even for a tall patient. Two is a larger SSD gives you a less steep dose fall off of the percent depth dose. And that results in better homogeneity through the patient. We'll see that in more detail in a minute. Second feature here is this device in the beam. So this is called a beam spoiler. And physically, the purpose of this device is to provide enhanced dose at superficial depths by giving electron contribution to the surface of the patient. Another feature that you'll see in these setups is there's a compensator here. So that's put in front of the patient. It's custom designed for the patient. And the purpose of that compensator is to make the dose more homogeneous. So for example, a ray passing through here, through the neck, where the patient is thinner, will be attenuated more to give less dose in that region where the thickness is less. Those compensators can also be placed up in the head of the machine instead of on the spoiler, but the purpose is the same. Now also, in this setup, you can put a lung block in front of the patient here. That allows you to reduce the dose to the lung. Finally, what you're seeing here is an APPA treatment, and there are some advantages to that. One particular one being it's easier to use a lung block. If you're shooting laterally, obviously you can't block the lung. So let's review some of the basic concepts in terms of dosimetry with two field plans and APPA, let's say. So I'm going to start here by imagining a beam coming in from this direction, and let's plot the depth dose curve for that beam. You get a sort of a smaller superficial dose, then it comes up and it falls off with depth, right? Now in TBI, actually, the surface dose is actually pretty close up here more, really. So let me redraw this. So it's more maybe like this. Okay, and then it falls off. Now let me imagine bringing in the PA beam now from this direction, and let's plot the depth dose for that. Again, same kind of situation. It comes up, and then it falls off. I'm trying to draw this evenly here. Okay, and now if I add these two beams together, it's going to be the sum of these two curves, right? That will be the total dose for an AP and PA treatment, is this one. Okay, so you'll see there's a little bit of inhomogeneity. It's hotter here than it is in the middle. And then let's look at how that depends on different parameters of the beam. So here's the plot I just showed you, but now blown up and shown with actual data. And now let's look at it at a different energy. So what I first drew was 6x. Now if I draw these curves for 18x, of course, the dose falls off less quickly with depth, and so you get a more even dose distribution. So that's the first thing to recognize, that the normal tissue dose decreases as you go to higher energy. In other words, this peak here, this homogeneity, is reduced at higher energies. The second thing is that this effect depends on thickness. So if you have a very thin patient, it's pretty much an even dose distribution, whereas if you go to a very thick patient, you'll get a very big inhomogeneity because of the fall off in depth of the beam. So normal tissue dose or inhomogeneity depends sensitively on the thickness of the patient. So we can actually calculate a metric that we'll call the dose homogeneity, and that's just equal to the dose at this peak here divided by the dose at midplane. And ideally those would be the same, and that number would be 1. So if you look at that number, dose homogeneity here on the left, plotted versus the patient thickness. So first of all, let's just look at this curve here on the top. It's for cobalt beam, and you'll see that as the patient gets thicker, it becomes less homogeneous. That's what you saw in those previous curves. Remember the 6x versus the 18x. The lower energy beam has a big inhomogeneity. Now as you go to higher energy, that effect falls off. It becomes more homogeneous here at 6 MV. And then here's at 25 MV. Okay, so the same effects that we were seeing in the plots, now just plotted quantitatively. The other thing is that it depends on the SSD, right? Remember, first let's look at the effect, okay? So here's 6 MV at 100 SSD, which we wouldn't really treat TBI, but there it is. You see it's fairly inhomogeneous. But if you go to extended distance, here's 6 MV at 300 SSD, it becomes much more homogeneous, right? More even dose. Why is that? That's because when you're at extended SSD, the PDD falls off less sharply, right? That curve is flatter, and so the homogeneity is better. So just as summary and review then, here are the 3 factors that affect dose homogeneity in TBI treatments: SSD, thickness, and energy. Here's some pictures of typical setups for TBI and treatments. Many times a patient will be placed in a stand like this where they can hold on, and then the spoiler goes on in front of the patient to increase the superficial dose. Sometimes there's a sort of a harness system used, as some of the TBI patients are quite sick, as you know. Here's what a lung block looks like here on a simulation film on the left, and then on the actual treatment film on the right. Typically, in many clinics, these are used for the first 4 out of 8 fractions, let's say, and the goal is to reduce the dose to the lung to about 70% of the prescription dose. So it's not a full block, but designed to decrease the toxicity there and still provide some dose to the bone marrow in the region. So these are your options for treatment. We've looked at standing beams treated APPA, but that's not the only way you can treat. You can also treat with lateral beams, and that could be with the patient standing up. You could treat sitting down or lying down, again, possibly with lateral beams. You could treat decubitus, patient laying on their side, and APPA. Or there's a special pediatric patient setup. Again, you want extended SSD, so they're down on the floor of the room. You need a beam spoiler, that's the plastic over the top of the patient. There's a block here for the lungs and a block for the head, and then there's compensation to even the dose out. So the lung blocks that I'm showing, it's not possible to use those in the lateral setup. You're actually relying on sort of the patient's arm to provide extra dose attenuation in the lung region. So that's one of the disadvantages of lateral treatments. Also, it's somewhat less homogeneous because the patient is thicker in the lateral direction. So that's something to account for. Now let's talk about verification. You want to make sure that you've delivered the right dose. And so different types of detectors are possible during treatment. And here are 3 of them. And I believe that diodes are the most commonly used detectors for this type of setup. And one of the main reasons is they're easy to use and you can get an immediate readout during or just after treatment. So these devices are typically left on for the entire treatment, read out at the end, and here are some locations where they might be placed. And then you would read out the dose at each location and make sure that it's homogeneous. In other words, that the compensator was built correctly. All right, so there are the basics of TBI. I'm going to have a reference list here for you, but in actuality, there are not that many publications about TBI. The reports from the AAPM are quite old. There are bits and pieces in the textbook, but there's not a whole lot out there. So I hope that this video and the text will give you a pretty good handle on the basics around TBI. Thank you.